The bonfire was lit. The cold cut through the early morning hours. And a man was trembling. He was no ordinary man. It was Peter, the same one who promised to die for Jesus. The same person who said, "Even if everyone abandons you, I won't." But that night, he said he didn't know the Master. Now imagine this. What if he hadn't denied it? What if it had stayed firm? What if he had proven his loyalty to the very end? Today you will understand something profound. It's not about Peter's fall. It's about the grace that comes after her. If this message speaks to you, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Because here, we don't tell stories. We reveal truths that transform. Pedro was no ordinary man. He was intense, impulsive, passionate. He was not walking with Jesus as a spectator. He threw himself down. When the others hesitated, Peter spoke. When the others retreated, Pedro advanced. He was the one who declared before everyone, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." It wasn't a rehearsed line. It was a revelation that burned inside. At that moment, Peter was not just a fisherman. He was someone who understood who was standing before him. But there's something that few people realize. Revelation does not eliminate weakness. Spiritual experience does not negate humanity. Peter witnessed miracles. He saw the dead rise again. He saw bread multiply in Jesus' hands. He himself walked on water. For a few seconds, he overcame the impossible. But it also sank. And there was already a sign there. The man who treads on the supernatural still carries human limitations. Even a man who professes faith can still tremble under pressure. At the Last Supper, when Jesus announces that everyone will abandon him, the atmosphere changes. The weight of betrayal hangs in the air. Jesus declares, "Tonight you will be scandalized because of me." Pedro reacts immediately. He doesn't think. He feels. Even if everyone is scandalized, I never will be. This phrase carries something profound. It's not just loyalty. It's a comparison. Even if they fail, I will not fail. Pedro wasn't just promising loyalty. He was relying on his own strength. And this is where the invisible conflict begins. Because spiritual self-confidence can resemble faith. But often it's just self-confidence. Jesus then looks at Peter and says something specific, direct, personal. "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. It wasn't a distant possibility. It was a prophecy about that very night. Pedro rejects the idea. He insists. He reaffirms it. Even if I have to die with you, I will never deny you. He believes that. He feels it. He speaks with conviction. But emotional conviction is not the same as spiritual resilience. Promises made in the heat of the moment need to survive the cold of the early morning. And Peter still didn't know what it was like to face God's silence. The arrest of the Master. The fear of one's own death. It's easy to promise loyalty when Jesus is multiplying loaves of bread. It's easy to declare courage when the crowd shouts, "Hosanna!" But what happens when the sword is sheathed? When the Master surrenders himself voluntarily? When does the sky seem unresponsive? Peter loved Jesus. That was never in doubt. The problem wasn't a lack of love. It was overconfidence. He believed that his devotion was enough, that his natural courage would sustain his faith. But there is a difference between loving Jesus and depend entirely on him. Pedro had not yet been broken. And before someone is used deeply by God, something needs to be broken from the inside. That promise made at the table was not false. She was sincere. But sincerity is no substitute for vigilance. Good intentions do not eliminate weakness. Pedro had no idea that a few hours later, he would be warming his hands by a strange fire, trying to blend into the crowd. He never imagined that the same mouth that declared, "You are the Christ," I would say, "I don't know him." But the downfall doesn't begin with denial. It starts with overconfidence. Jesus knew. That's why he warned. Not to expose Pedro, but to prepare it. And here is the first great lesson from this story. Anyone who thinks they're safe needs to be vigilant. Pedro represents all of us. Intense in their promise. strong in their statement, sincere in their intentions, but still fragile under pressure. If Peter had not made that bold promise, perhaps he never realized how much he needed grace. Because sometimes God allows our own security to be tested, to reveal where our strength truly lies. At that table, Pedro saw himself as a rock, but it was still sand mixed with emotion, and the wind was about to blow. Topic 2. The courtyard, the bonfire, and the pressure of fear. The night grew darker. Jesus was taken away, tied up, judged, exposed. The disciples scattered. Fear overcame the crowd that had been singing hours before. Pedro, however, decided to follow from a distance. This detail is silent but profound. He didn't give up completely, but he didn't stay close either. Following from afar is the first sign of spiritual weakening. He wanted to see what would happen. I wanted to be informed, but I didn't want to be identified. The high priest's courtyard was lit by torches. Guards patrolled. Servants whispered. The atmosphere was tense. In the center, a bonfire. Pedro approaches. Sit down between them. Extend your hands towards the fire. The contrast is stark. While Jesus faces accusation and violence, Pedro is trying to warm up. While the master is being questioned, the disciple tries to blend in. That's where it all begins. A maid is watching him. She has no sword. It has no religious authority. It's not a military threat. Just look and say, "You were with him too." A simple sentence, but fraught with risk. Pedro replies quickly, "I don't know what you're talking about." The initial denial wasn't explosive. It was defensive. He didn't scream. He avoided it. Fear began to act in a subtle way. Sometimes the downfall doesn't begin with big decisions. It starts with small setbacks. Peter gets up. He goes to the entrance, perhaps thinking that he would be safer there. But someone else recognizes him. This man was also with Jesus of Nazareth. Now the pressure is increasing. The voices are getting closer. Eyes are turning more attentive. Pedro answers again, with more firmness, with oath. "I don't know this man." Notice the distance in the words. It's no longer Jesus. It's that man. Fear begins to alter the discourse. The language is starting to change. It begins to erase ties. Following from a distance produced this. Proximity to the wrong fire caused this. Pedro was trying to survive. Perhaps some thoughts crossed your mind. If I get arrested, it's over. If they identify me, I'll die too. I need to wait for this to pass. Human instinct prevailed over the promise made at the table. And then, for the third time, some of those who were there approached. "You're one of them. The way you talk gives you away." Now it's no longer an isolated accusation. It's collective confirmation. Pedro feels the siege. And then it happens. He starts cursing, to swear, to declare with intensity, "I don't know this man." At that exact moment, the rooster crows. The sound cuts through the air. It interrupts the early morning hours. Divide the story. And Jesus looks at him. There is no record of words. Just one look. A gaze that transcends distance. That which transcends guilt. Which goes beyond justifications. Pedro remembers. Remember the table. Remember the promise. Remember the warning. Everything comes back like a weight on my chest. The bonfire that was supposed to warm. Now it burns inside. The man who said he would die for Jesus. He couldn't stand a servant's question. But this is where we need to understand something essential. Peter did not deny it because he hated Jesus. He refused because he feared death. The pressure revealed what was not yet strengthened. And that is human reality. Courage in public is one thing. Loyalty under threat is another matter. Peter confronted soldiers in Gethsemane with a sword in his hand. But he couldn't bear the thought of suffering alone. He still did not understand that the kingdom of God, it is not sustained by the strength of the flesh. The bonfire in the courtyard revealed the internal conflict. True love, real fear, sincere faith, human instinct. If Peter hadn't passed through that courtyard, Perhaps he would never realize how much he needed to be transformed from within. Because the biggest battlefield wasn't in the courtroom. It was in his heart. And in that early morning, the promise made in the heat of the moment, it collided with the pressure of fear. The rooster crowed, not just to announce a failure, but to awaken a conscience. The night was not yet over, but something inside Pedro had already been broken. Topic 3. The tears that broke pride. The rooster crowed. The sound lingered through the early morning hours like a death sentence. It wasn't just the announcement of a new day. It was confirmation of a fall. Pedro freezes. External noise triggers an internal echo. And then something even deeper happens. Jesus is looking at him. In the midst of the confusion. Amidst the screams. In the midst of injustice. That look meets Pedro's. It wasn't a look of surprise. It wasn't a look of rejection. It was a look that said, "I warned you. I knew. And even so, I chose you." In that second, all the words from the Last Supper come flooding back to memory. Before the rooster crows, Pedro didn't fail because he wasn't warned. He failed due to overconfidence. And now there was no more argument. There was no longer any justification. There was no longer any comparison with the other disciples. There was only truth. The Bible says that he left there and wept bitterly. He did not cry in front of the crowd. He didn't make a speech. He didn't try to explain himself. He left because there are pains that need silence. Those tears weren't just out of remorse. It was a breakdown. Peter was seeing himself without filters. The brave man, the bold disciple, he who walked on water, the one who promised to die. Now it was the man who said, "I don't know this man." Pride has fallen. Self-confidence crumbled. The image he had of himself was shattered. And that hurts. It hurts to realize that we are capable of what we swore we would never do. It hurts to discover that our strength has limits. It hurts to face one's own weakness without spiritual makeup. But there is something powerful here. Pedro didn't run away permanently. He went out to cry. The crying reveals that the heart was still alive. Judas also betrayed. But Judas ran into despair. Pedro ran away, bursting into tears. There is a difference between guilt that paralyzes and regret that transforms. Peter's weeping was bitter, but it wasn't empty. There, an invisible transformation began. Because God doesn't only work in public victories. He works in dark rooms, in the silent early mornings, in broken hearts. If Peter had not denied it, perhaps he continued to believe that he was strong by nature. But that night he discovered something bigger. He needed grace, not just to be called, but to stay. Not just to follow Jesus in miracles, but to follow him through the pain. Tears washed away pride. The comparison is washed away. It washed away self-sufficiency. The man who said, "I never." Now he understood that he couldn't achieve anything on his own. And here is a profound truth. God does not reject broken hearts. He resists pride, but it draws closer to the repentant. Pedro was being molded. The fall exposed the fragility, but crying opened the door to dependency. Perhaps that morning he remembered another moment, when it began to sink in the waters, and shouted, "Lord, save me." That day, Jesus stretched out his hand. Now, in the courtyard, he wasn't physically sinking. I was sinking inside. And the same Lord who held him at sea, he would still support his guilt. The crying wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the restoration. Because proud men preach about strength. Broken men preach about grace. And God knew that Peter would lead multitudes. He first needed to be healed from the inside. That morning, before sunrise, a proud fisherman died, and a dependent pastor began to emerge. The rooster crowed. Pedro cried. And the sky was already preparing for a new beginning. Days passed. The cross happened. The tomb was sealed. And then, it was empty. Jesus has risen from the dead. But inside Pedro, there was still an echo of that early morning. The sound of the rooster crowing wouldn't leave my memory. Jesus' gaze was still alive. He had seen the resurrected Lord. But that didn't automatically erase the memory of the denial. Because declared forgiveness is one thing. Internal guilt is another matter. Pedro decides to return to what he knew. I'm going fishing. It wasn't just about work. It was about refuge. When the soul is confused, the human being runs to what is familiar. A reed. The boat. The sea. Perhaps, in the silence of the waters, he was trying to organize his thoughts. Perhaps he wondered if he was still worthy of being called a disciple. Fishing all night long. Nothing. Empty networks again. And then, at dawn, a voice on the beach. Children, do you have anything to eat? They reply. No. A voce orienta. Cast the net on the right side. They obey. And the net fills up. Pedro's heart races. John recognizes first. It is the Lord. Pedro doesn't wait for the boat to arrive. He throws himself into the sea. The same man who had previously followed from afar now dived to get closer. Something has changed. On the beach, a bonfire is lit. It's no coincidence. Another bonfire marked his downfall. Now another bonfire would mark its restoration. Jesus prepares bread and fish. It doesn't begin with an accusation. It doesn't start with a charge. It begins with communion. After the meal, the question arises. Simon, son of John, do you love me? Inner silence. It's not just a question. It's an invitation to the truth. Pedro replies, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus says, Feed my lambs. But Jesus asks again, Simon, do you love me? The second time it goes in deeper. It's not empty repetition. It's intentional restoration. Pedro answers again. And then, for the third time, Jesus asks 3 questions. Not to humiliate, but to heal. Each question was met with a denial. Each answer reconstructed an identity. Around the bonfire in the courtyard, Pedro said 3 times that he didn't know. At the beach bonfire, he declares his love 3 times. Jesus does not ignore failure. But she doesn't define Pedro either. He doesn't say, Why did you deny me? He asks, You love me. Because the kingdom cannot be sustained by the absence of error. It is sustained by the presence of true love. Pedro becomes saddened by the third question. Not out of irritation, but because he understood what was happening. Jesus was touching the wound, and by touching it was healing. After each answer, a mission. Feed the flock. Take care. Feed. The call was not cancelled. The failure did not negate the purpose. This changes everything. If Peter had not denied it, perhaps he would never understand the depth of the grace that was now restoring him. The man who wept bitterly. Now I heard words of confidence. Jesus did not just forgive. He reaffirmed his destiny. And there's something even stronger. Jesus reveals to Peter that one day he would truly die for him. Earlier, Peter had vowed to die and failed. Now, Jesus prophesies that he will die faithful. The difference? It used to be self-confidence. Now it is dependence shaped by grace. By the sea, Peter was not only comforted. It has been redefined. Denial has not been erased from history. It was transformed into a testimony. Because leaders who know their own weaknesses, they become more compassionate shepherds. He who has experienced mercy, learned to offer mercy. On that beach, to the sound of the waves, Pedro is no longer the man of impulsive promises, and he became the man of restored love. The bonfire that previously exposed the weakness. Now it illuminated a new beginning, and the sky silently declared. The fall did not end the call. Grace deepened him. Topic 5. The man whom grace transformed. After that morning by the sea, something inside Pedro was never the same again. He didn't just come back with a nice memory. He returned with a restored identity. The impulsive Pedro still existed, but now there was depth. There was awareness. There was dependency. Days later, in Jerusalem, the scene changes again. A crowd gathered. Noise. Expectation. The Holy Spirit descends. And who stands up to speak? Pedro. The same one who trembled before a maid. Now he faces a crowd. The same one who denied it out of fear. Now he boldly proclaims, Jesus, whom you crucified, God has made both Lord and Christ. There is no hesitation. There is no escape. There's no disguise. The man who previously said, I don't know this man. Now he publicly declares who he is. 3,000 people surrendered that day. What has changed? Grace changed him. Pedro did not preach as someone who never fell. He preached like someone who had been raised up. And that makes all the difference. Those who have never experienced mercy talk about rules. Those who have been restored speak of hope. Pedro knew the weight of guilt. Therefore, he could announce the relief of forgiveness. He knew what it was like to fail miserably. That's why I knew that no one was too far from grace. Later, he would face imprisonment, threats, whipping, and, according to tradition, he would die for Christ. But this time it was no longer an impulsive promise. It was mature loyalty. The one who once said, I will never deny you. He learned that loyalty doesn't come from human strength. It is born from daily dependence on God. If Peter had not denied Jesus, perhaps he would become just another confident leader, respected but not profoundly transformed. But because it fell, it was broken. Because it was broken, it was shaped. Because it was shaped, it was used in a powerful way. The fall did not destroy his destiny. He prepared it for himself. This confronts us. How many times do we believe that one mistake ends everything? How often do we think that God only uses flawless people? Pedro's story proves otherwise. God is not looking for perfect resumes. He seeks repentant hearts. He does not build his kingdom with people who never fail. Build with people who learn from failure. Peter became a pillar of the church. He wrote letters. It strengthened the brothers. He encouraged those who were persecuted. And there is something interesting in his words. He talks about humility, regarding surveillance, about the devil who roars like a lion, on remaining steadfast in faith. These are not theories. These are pieces of advice from someone who has already fallen. And it was lifted. The restored Pedro was not arrogant. He was aware. I knew that, without God, I could deny him again. Did you know that dependence is not weakness? It's spiritual survival? And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. Grace does not merely forgive. She transforms character. She picks up a man who has failed publicly and makes him an example of perseverance. She picks someone who has cried bitterly and transforms it into a voice of encouragement. She picks someone who was afraid and makes him confront empires. The initial question still echoes. What if Peter had not denied Jesus? Perhaps he would never understand the depth of the love that restored him. Perhaps he never preached about mercy with such conviction. He might never become the leader the church needed. Because sometimes the greatest proof of God's love, it's not about preventing us from falling. It's about getting up after her. Final closing. Perhaps you, too, have experienced your own dawn. Perhaps the rooster has already crowed in your story. Perhaps you made a promise and didn't keep it. Spoken and withdrawn. Loved and denied through actions. But Pedro's story doesn't end in the courtyard. It ends in transformation. Jesus' gaze was not one of condemnation. It was by invitation. And that same question remains relevant today. You love me? This is not a question meant to make accusations. It's a question that needs to be addressed. Because grace is still available. It's still possible to start over. The call was not canceled. If this message spoke to your heart, please like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to remember that falling doesn't mean the end. Because when grace enters the scene, the story begins again. And God still transforms deniers in leaders full of courage.